Hello, everyone. Thank you again for listening and watching. As always, it's a great privilege for me to share some thought with you. And today we really going to address a very important topic and subject that is very dear to my heart, and I hope it is to you as well. And by subject, I mean is the interesting element that exists within the confine of the topic and subject. I hope by now you realize that I am committed to address the event of our time, the movement, the trends, as well as the happenings of all the things that are taking place. As I said before, I will say it again, not only around the world, but also in our individual and personal lives. I've identified those things as noise and noisemaker as a figurative speaking, and how they're affecting our lives on an individual basis as well as on a collective basis. And so today we want to talk about what I call forces and their noisemaker in the postmodern era. And one of the forces in the postmodern era is not new. It's been around forever. It's been in existence so long as existence exists in and of itself, and is the force that come to be known today, had known that way for quite some time, but is the force of science and religion. I am fully aware of the fact that there are countless individuals all over the world that are addressing these issues. And I feel that I am very privileged to have the ability to learn so much over the years from the great men and women, I believe, that have addressed this issue. The war, the conflict that exists between science and religion. Not to say that science in and of itself is an element of darkness, but if we can use this conflict, science and religion, interchangeably, when we say science and religion, it's literally saying light and darkness. Now, science in and of itself, there's nothing dark about science. I am a very scientifically minded individual, and I appreciate and very thankful for all the things that we have learned through scientific endeavor and through scientific means and knowledge. So let me be clear that science, in and of itself, there is nothing dark about science. We know that, I know that, because science embedded in the element of creation and the natural world. But to the extent that those who's using science to denounce and reject the existence of creation, thereby take a dark view of the scientific plane. And thus, I said that when we talk about science and religion, with the context of the war and the conflict, the opposition that exists between science and religion, we're actually talking about light and darkness, only to the extent we're using science to denounce and reject the fundamental principle of creation. And so today we're looking at the force, as I call them, in the noisemaker and postmodern era. And this has been on forever, as I said before, the war between science and religion, which is actually a war between light and darkness. This podcast, I will return to it again because part of it is part of addressing science and religion today, and I will come back to it as a second part, and we will look at the part that, as some are called, quote, God hypothesis. We will look at that. And briefly, just before we go on, I also want to remind you we're getting very close to the event that I have invited you coming on September the 23rd. That is a Saturday in our studio in Lebanon, where we will have a free seminar on trauma, adult living with childhood trauma. We are living in a traumatized world, as I shared with you before, and I want to remind you of this upcoming event on September the 23rd between the hour of 5 to 7:30 p.m. at the studio in Lebanon, Pennsylvania. The event is free, so please pre-register on our website as well as on our Facebook page. We make those information available to you. September 23rd from 5 to 7:30 p.m. We were looking into this very important topic, trauma and adult living with childhood trauma. And I am looking forward to see you there. There's a term, this term called New Atheism, a term that was coined by the American journalist Gary Wolfe in 2006, describing the fundamental position and the argument of some of the atheist academics, writers, scientists, and philosophers of the postmodern era, the New Atheism. The New Atheism, Wolfe advocates that the view that any view that is superstition, religious, and irrationalism should not simply be tolerated, say the New Atheism. They are to be contend because this view should be criticized, counter, examined, and challenged by rational argument, especially when they exert strong influence on the broad society, such as government, education, and politics. And so the New Atheist movement is calling the world to not only just tolerate view that atheists consider to be superstition, religious, and creational view, but those views are to be argued forcefully because of their strong influence they exert on a broader society, and as the name is, such as religion, such as rather government, education, and politics. Some of the prominent individuals on the front of this New Atheist movement, individuals include like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, and Ayaan Harris Ali. There are many of them, but these are some of the ones that seem to be on the front line. A gentleman by Geoffrey Berg, who's a graduate at Cambridge University, England, believed that the case for atheism has never been put in a forceful and logically cogent ways as it merit, least of all by the great philosopher, he continued. In his book, he set out to remedy that by strengthening some traditional atheistic argument and by initiating some new logical argument for atheism. Mr. Berg developed 6 complete, what he called logical argument, unquote, that practically everybody can understand in a way that has never been done before to prove that, quote, the belief in God is not merely unsupported by logic, but it is actually contrary to logic, unquote, says Mr. Berg. That the belief in God is not only not supported by logic, but actually contrary to logic, Mr. Berg says in his book. You see, this is a claim, as he said, to fine-tune the case for atheism in such a way that has not been done before, and it is likely, in his view and with respect, that the language he's using and the movement it's creating with this idea of the New Atheism will be a landmark argument that is likely to be used and find great support by other atheists around the world. Another one is one of the world's best-selling scientists, professor, and communicator, Richard Dawkins, calling the world to seize the opportunity to rethink the big question. And the big question is, does God exist? Unquote. Mr. Dawkins explained how the natural world arose without a designer, the improbability and the beauty of the bottom-up programming that engineered an android of a flock of startling and challenge heads on some of the most basic assumptions made by world religion. Should we believe in God? A question, Mr. Dawkins said, in his brisk introduction to the modern new atheism. He made it very clear we should not. Deeply impressed by the beauty and the complexity of living things, Mr. Dawkins felt certain that they must have had a designer, not so clear. He doesn't believe that. Learning about evolution changed his mind. Now he is one of the world's best-selling author, scientist, and communicator, have given reader, particularly young readers, and old as well, the same opportunity to rethink this big question: does God exist? Mr. Dawkins asking. In 12 fiercely mind-expanding, Mr. Dawkins explained how the natural world arose without a designer. He made that very clear. And that he challenged head-on some of the most basic assumptions made by religious people around the world. Do you believe in God? Which one? Is the Bible a good book? Question, unquote. Is adhering to religious necessary or even likely to make people good to one another? Dissecting everything from Abraham's abuse of Isaac to the construction of the snowflake, in his book, another book he wrote called The Outgrowing God, is a concise, provocative guide to thinking of yourself. However, Mr. Dawkins' new book that is very popular, is not new in terms of recent, but been around for a while, is especially a terrain of atheist plea for humanism and rationalism, precisely since it speaks to those most vulnerable, the young, and to coercive tactics of religion. As Dawkins himself said, in the dedication of this book, I will repeat it very soon, it's a very well-known book, is for all young people when they're old enough to decide for themselves whether they want to believe in God or not. It is also, I must add, for their parent as well. Another individual who is a great support of Mr. Dawkins is Jana Levine. She is the author of a book called The Black Hole Blues. When someone is considering atheism, I tell them, they say, to read all of the Bible first and then Dawkins, Outgrowing God, second, only to the Bible. Another individual is Penn Jillette, author of God? No. Approximation mark. Should we believe in God? In this brief introduction, the modern atheist, one of the world's greatest scientists as well, says we should not. And the book we're talking about of Mr. Dawkins, is the God delusion. And the God delusion, Mr. Dawkins contends that a supernatural creator, God, almost certainly does not exist, and that the belief in a personal God qualified as delusional. And so therefore I am, for believing in God, I am deluded. I'm not well, according to Mr. Dawkins, which he defined as a persistent false belief held in the face of strong contradictory evidence, and he is referring to scientific evidence of the natural world. He went on to say that he is sympathetic to Robert Persig's, you know who he is, statement in Leela, 1991, that when one person suffers from a delusion, that's a quote, when a person is suffer from a delusion, it's called insanity. When many people suffer from a delusion, it's called a religion. That's Mr. Dawkins' point of view. In the book, Mr. Dawkins explores the relationship between religion and morality, providing evidence that discuss the possibility of morality existing independently of religion and suggesting alternative explanation for the origin of both religion and morality. So Richard Dawkins is telling you and I, we are the author of our own destiny, and that the universe was created by some accidental molecule out of control, which is an old view, it's nothing new, random, no systematic, no designer, no function of operative, no pattern, completely out of bound, out of control, by chances, random, and you and I were simply just hub of our DNA, as Dr. John Lennox quote, we just dancing to the music of our DNA. No designer, no God. If there's no God, I can do whatever I want. I can say whatever I want. I can be whatever I want. I am not bound by any higher authority or anyone else. In early December of 2006, that book reached the number one, or the number four rather, in the New York Times hardcover of nonfiction bestseller list after 9 weeks on that list. More than 3 million copies were sold. According to Dawkins in the 2016 interview with Mike De La Honte, an authorized Arabic translation of this book has downloaded 3 million times, and guess where? In Saudi Arabia. The book has attracted widespread commentary, the God delusion that is, and critical reception, with many books written in response to it. Dawkins has presented argument against the foundational view of creationist explanation of life in his previous work on evolution. The theme, The Blind Watchmaker, published in 1986, is the evolution that can explain the apparent design of nature, not God, according to Richard Dawkins. And he went on to say in The God Delusion, he focused directly on a wider range of argument used for and against the belief and the existence of God. Dawkins identified himself as repeatedly as an atheist, while also pointing out that, in a sense, he is also agnostic, though only to the extent that, quote, I'm agnostic about theory at the bottom of the garden. That's a story we'll get into some other time. I heard a story about how Richard Dawkins has long wanted to write a book openly criticized religion, but his publisher had advised him against it. But by 2006, his publisher had warned the idea to the idea that Dawkins attributed to change his mind. But he says, this is a story I read online, 4 years of Bush, I believe he meant President George W. Bush, 4 years of Bush presidency, literally said that God told him to invade Iraq. That was a big influence on Mr. Dawkins. By the time, a number of authors, including Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens, who together with Richard Dawkins were labeled the Unholy Trinity by Robert Wetzel, had already written books openly attacking religion. According to Amazon.com and the UK retailer, in August 2007, the book was the bestseller in their sales of books on religion and spirituality. With Christopher Hitchens, God is not great, how religion poisoned everything, coming second. That was in 2007 in England. This led to a 50% growth in that category over the 3-year to date. The book contained 10 chapters. The first chapter make a case that there almost certainly is no God, while the rest of the book discuss religion and morality. And Mr. Dawkins continued that the God delusion contained 4 consciousness-raising messages. 1, atheists can be happy, balanced, moral, and intellectually fulfilled. 4 consciousness. That's the one. Number 2, he says, natural selection and similar scientific theory are superior to a God hypothesis. The illusion of intelligent design in explaining the living world and the cosmos. Number 3, children, he said, should not be labeled by their parents' religion. Terms like Catholic child, Muslim child, they should make people cringe, he went on to say, quote. Number 4, atheists should be proud, not apologetic, because atheism is evidence of a healthy, independent mind. 4 of the conscience put together by Mr. Richard Dawkins. Science and religion. Atheists can be happy, balanced, moral, intellectually fulfilled, and the natural election and scientific theory are superior than God, and that children should not be labeled after the parent religion. There's another time and other people that live to some of those very things that you and I are facing today. I want to quickly looking at a biblical view. As I said, I want to look at the God hypothesis in the next podcast. But I want to look at a time when we call moral relativism. That is one of the noise maker we will address. It is not new, just a new terminology. In the time of Babylon, great power, that you do know, and I'm sure you must have heard that before, that when we talk about Babylon, Babylon is derived from Babel, as you would call the Tower of Babel, or built by the descendant of Cain. The Tower of Babel, later on we find that the Babylonian civilization is directly derived out of Babel, the city of Babel, where the people was built the tower to reach to the sky. And so the story we want to know is a few years later, we find that under King Nebuchadnezzar, who subdued the nation Israel, and the some of the young men that were taken captive and were moved to um, Babylon, was one of them was Daniel and his three friends. Daniel was taken into the heart of the world's most advanced civilization at a very young age. Nevertheless, Daniel was managed to maintain his integrity, his faith, and nourish while continuing to hold on to his divine faith without compromise and stand strong with moral integrity and fortitude. Daniel, like many of us need to do today, committed to deep thought, extensive research, and transfixed focus on the view of paganistic culture in which he was surrounding by. And you and I must develop the same passion to navigate and to draw very, very clear understanding the informative parallel between these old age forces like the one Daniel was exposed to and to the one you and I are facing in this postmodern era. When we look at Daniel's life in the book of Daniel, circumstances and the contemporary believers' life circumstances, you can see the similarity there. Very clear evidence that the same forces that Daniel was reckoned with, the same forces that Daniel was facing, you and I are facing the same force today. Nevertheless, with piercing eye to see and to understand how the same Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar was a place where value were relativized, but that Daniel and his three friends maintained their distinctiveness in the face of enormous pressure, even the threat of death. And that's the spirit you and I need in the face of this postmodern noise era, light and darkness. We need to be aware, and we need to see, and we need to understand, even places in the furnace of King Nebuchadnezzar. And the king was convinced there was no one alive, but yet God, we know the end of the story, intervened on behalf of his servant Daniel. So, my friend, you need to understand these punitive acts were designed to force a clash between the laws of God, the Logos, and the laws of the state, King Nebuchadnezzar. So is our time. Our time is not simply a question of values, image, and identity. Our time, as well as Daniel's time, is a question of divine law versus man-made ideology. And Daniel did not stay silent, nor should you and I. There is no doubt in my mind that with the reality that you and I can draw a clear parallel between our modern society in which Christians are facing with the same pressure and threat as those in the past, as the fight between absolute truth and relativism, a fight that based on fundamental moral principle are threatened by the legal system who remain unsympathetic to God and to Christian view. And so there is no question, you can see there's a fight that is taking place between light and darkness and is no small matter. If you notice all the attacks on religious belief in the last few years, the new atheists such as A.C. Grayling, as I just mentioned, Richard Dawkins, Stephen Hawking, Sam Harris, it's the same forces Daniel faces, the prophets, and many others, Moses as well, Joseph in Egypt. And those attempt to ban the free expression of religious faith in the public square, attempt to have us to be quiet, to keep our mouth shut, keep your religious on the wrap, do not speak of God and on the public square. And as you know today, what is and where is the public square today? The internet, the workplace, the community, the school, the industry, the government. These are the public square. Wherever we go, we have to be silenced. And so you and I need to know very clear that the genius of the biblical corpus is that it shows you and I that the same pressure operate in the early culture is the same pressure that is manifested today. We can take those principles and apply them to our lives, to take a stand, to raise our voices on behalf of absolute truth and moral principle that adhere on the biblical divine laws of God. There are many things encroaching on our fundamental value, and we face question about where and how to take a stand. But the fact of the matter, this occurs, and I find myself enormously encouraging to know that I am not the first one, nor am I alone in this fight. And you and I need to know very well that what you were talking about in the postmodern, it didn't start in the 1970s. It was happening in a year before, way back, century, the 5th, the 6th, the 8th century BC as well. And that there are many parallels with what you and I are seeing today in the world that happens before. I want to mention a gentleman very quickly. His name is Michael Denton. Michael Denton is a British proponent of intelligent design and senior fellow at the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. He holds a PhD degree in biochemistry. His Denton books on evolution, A Theory in Crisis, inspire intelligent design proponent Philip Johnson and Michael Behe. In his book, The Miracle of Man, Mr. Michael Denton is well known for his view, hold that we know through science about the nature of the physical universe is best explained by the hypothesis that is the work of an intelligent design, or in the Christian term, the work of God. In The Miracle of Man, Mr. Denton knows that whereas in the Middle Age, human beings were seen as being at the center of the universe, from the mid-16th century, we know the story onward, a range of scientific discovery led to this anthropocentric view being generally rejected. The old view of the cosmos with the earth at the center of humanity, and humanity as special creation by God, was replaced by the view that the earth was an unremarkable planet and that the existence of humanity was meaningless cosmic accident. However, Mr. Denton argued this view is now itself outdated because detailed scientific study since the 19th century has made it very clear that humans are clearly no contingent afterthought. They exquisitely fine-tuned, assembled, of the environmental fitness described here each enable a vital aspect of our physiological design, amount to nothing less than a primal blueprint of our being written into the fabric of reality from the moment of creation, providing compelled evidence that we do, after all, occupy a central place in the great cosmic drama of being. He further, Mr. Denton adds, nature is uniquely fine-tuned, enable being of biological design and size to make fire, develop and mythology, to build and advance in technological civilization, and come to do science and its unique fitness for our type of life. He went on to say, quote, it is as if an act of extraordinary prescience there was built into nature from the very beginning, a suit of property finely calibrated for being for our physiological and anatomical design, for and our ability to follow the path of technological enlightenment from the Stone Age to the present. And so therefore, from a Christian perspective, the result of this purely scientific argument is to show that the atheist argument of its writers, such as Richard Dawkins and all the rest of them I just mentioned, are undermine the very science to which they appeal to. Christian writers, really, as William Paley, the author of Natural Theology, will write all along. Nature testified to the belief, thought, and the biblical corpus that human beings exist and the way they exist because they were designed to do so by the Creator God, the God hypothesis in brief. Indeed, the work of science or scientists such as Deaton provide us with such an even more awe-inspiring understanding of God's activity than we previously possessed. They tell us that God has been working precisely in detail throughout its creation over billions and billions of years since God first brought to the universe into being. Nothing is accidental, I must submit. All is part of God's design plan. Science and religion, a fight that's been going on for many years, for many centuries, for ages, is raging today ever so fiercely. And you and I thrust into it, not by accident. We were meant to be here. One of the arguments of atheists using evolutionary theory is that the universe has no purpose. Your life, you and I, have no purpose, and that we're simply the byproduct of random chances. If you notice what's going on, for thousands of years, mankind been working diligently to remove God from existence. Although they've been very unsuccessful of making that happen, nevertheless, the negative impact this have on the whole world of humanity is enormously, and there's no words I can use that will explain that. And we're seeing it today. If you look around, with the absence of God in our own country, in the United States of America, in neighboring countries like Canada, and all over the world, in Europe, in England, in many other parts of the world, notice the moment we remove the appearance of the divinity of God, notice what's happening. I can do whatever I want. I can say, I want to be a man. I want to be a woman. Notice what happened. How a movement is undermining the fundamental principle of the crown of creation that we find in the book of Genesis, that tell us very clear, very plain, the author of creation In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and man was made in the image of God. I like a word that I used some time ago, amigo Dei, in the image of God in Latin. Yes, in the image of God made he, male and female. We are not meaningless. We are not purposeless. We have a meaning and we have a deep purpose to which we were brought into existence, because God, who designed it all, is greater than them all. And God have proved that to the world by becoming man in the person of the Lord Jesus Christ, the God incarnate. God embody humanity, because God is limitless. God is not. See, that's one of the big mistake of atheists in evolution. They're looking at the laws of nature, who imposed by God, that God himself is restricted by those laws. Now, this is interesting because they look at the design, and then they deny the designer. If I design something, I'm not bound by it. It's interesting to see if we don't have those things anymore. But if you go to a tailor and make a suit for you, and for some reason there is something wrong with the suit, you can go to the tailor, put the suit on, and he will see what's wrong with it. He will take the suit apart and fix it. He's not bound by the thread and the pieces of cloth that put together. He can do anything he wants to the suit, because he's not bound by the structure that he himself put together in that which he designed. God is not bound by natural law. And so you make a grave mistake if all you do is to lose nature to identify God. And since you approach that very endeavor with a very blind eye, you cannot see what's in front of you, as the biblical corpus clearly indicate. That nature, the universe, testify to the existence of God. Next time we were looking at, as I share with you, the God hypothesis, to see how the Bible and three view, and by three view I mean historically, okay, as well as in word, as well as personal experience, coincide in every which way. There is no contradiction when it comes to the scripture to give clear evidence that there is a designer behind existence. And I will share some of those thoughts. Again, I am fully aware of countless men and women all over the world addressing this issue, science and religion. I am fully aware of that, and I learn a lot from them, and I will continue to learn from them and share those thoughts with you. But in my little corner of the world where I'm at, I will take those privilege to share those thoughts with you. Science and religion. And we were looking at the God hypothesis, a war that's been waged for centuries, since creation itself. Now, the interesting thing we need to know, and I will say that in closing, that we know where this conflict begins. I am under no illusion, as said by Richard Dawkins, what is the origin of this war? To deny the existence of God and to bring darkness into bear. We know where it all started. We will talk about that some other time. But science and religion at war with each other, forces of darkness, and they know its maker in a postmodern era. Beware, my friend. Beware. Be focused. Be diligent in learning and be well informed, lest you find yourself swallowed up by the waves of darkness. Science and religion, the forces and their noisemakers in postmodern era. As always, I thank you very much for your time. And again, let me remind you that this podcast, Mindful Conversation for Critical Time, that's the name of our podcast. Please watch our podcast, criticize it, give me some point, and show me and help me make it better because we're in this together. I would love your comment and your point of view. And if there's a topic you would like to share and you would like me to share, I was talking to some of my friends who tell me that at some point of time we might want to do some live session that will be quite an adventure. I will definitely look into that. I would love to do that. But until then, please subscribe when you watch this this podcast. And I appreciate your time as well as your comment. And please, I want to remind you again about the upcoming event on September the 23rd. We were looking at trauma, adult living with trauma. We are living in a very traumatized world. If there's any other time we need to talk about trauma, with all the things that are going on, our children and adults as well are facing trauma every day. We want to look at some of the aspects of adult living with childhood trauma on September the 23rd. Until then, Mindful Conversation for Critical Time is a production of InSearch Innovation, and we will continue to do our due diligent learning, researching, reading, and looking into some of the issues plaguing our world and share those thoughts with you. Until then, listen. Thank you very much. I want to thank everyone for listening. And if you haven't subscribed, do so to stay tuned with our future conversation. Again, this podcast is a production of InSearch Innovation. Once again, thank you for listening.